This video is about Pule, P-U-L-E, a Serbian artisan cheese produced exclusively at Zasavica Special Nature Reserve in northwestern Serbia, approximately 93 miles from Belgrade. Pule is the most expensive cheese in the world, selling for over $450 per pound, made entirely from the raw milk of the Balkan donkey, a critically endangered breed managed by conservation ecologist Slobodan Simić since the late 1990s. It takes approximately 6.5 gallons of hand-milked donkey milk to produce a single pound of finished Pule cheese. The entire global annual supply rarely exceeds 660 pounds. There is no factory, no industrial process, and no competing producer anywhere in the world. What follows is the complete story of why this cheese exists, who made it, who buys it, and whether any of it was ever truly an accident. This is the story of Pule, pronounced Pule, the Serbian word for foal. And if you are already wondering why a cheese named after a baby horse costs more per ounce than sterling silver, that is exactly the right question to be asking. Because the answer involves one of the rarest and most endangered animals in the Balkans, one of the most labor-intensive food production processes anywhere in the modern world, and one man working alone in a river swamp who may have either stumbled into the most valuable food discovery of the century or engineered it from the beginning. There is an important difference between those two possibilities, and by the end of this video, we are going to examine both very carefully. Before we talk about Pule specifically, we need to put $450 per pound in genuine context because that number in isolation does not fully capture the scale of what we are dealing with. Saffron, the world's most expensive spice, trades at around $2,200 per pound, but you purchase it by the gram, and a single gram seasons a meal for 12. White truffles from northern Italy can reach over $1,300 per pound in an exceptional season, and kopi luwak, the coffee processed through Asian palm civets, sells for approximately $320 per pound. These are the foods that get written about in financial newspapers. These are the ingredients that make the documentary segment on extreme luxury food. Pule sits comfortably in this company, and in most production years, quietly exceeds several of them. There is a cheese called White Stilton Gold that occasionally appears at the top of most expensive cheese lists, and it is worth addressing directly because it is often confused with the story we are telling here. White Stilton Gold is a British Stilton infused with edible gold leaf and champagne liqueur, and it can sell for over $450 per pound. But food historians and serious cheese authorities are consistent in pointing out that White Stilton Gold is almost entirely a novelty product. Its price is driven by the gold flake additive, which contributes nothing whatsoever to the flavor of the cheese itself. Pule is a completely different category of expensive. Pule costs what it costs because of what it fundamentally is, not because of what has been inserted into it. The price is not a marketing strategy. It is the unavoidable mathematical result of where this cheese comes from and how absurdly difficult it is to produce. Zasavica Special Nature Reserve sits in northwestern Serbia, approximately 93 miles from Belgrade, built around a protected loop of the Zasavica River. It was officially designated as a protected wetland in 1997, created to preserve a rare floodplain ecosystem that had been steadily shrinking for decades under agricultural pressure. The reserve covers nearly 2,500 acres of oxbow lakes, river forest, and open marshland, a landscape that looks, in honest terms, like something from a medieval illuminated manuscript. Herons stand motionless at the water's edge. Dense reeds border channels that open without warning into still, mirror-flat lakes. You are not walking through this landscape and thinking about the global luxury food economy. The man who took over management of Zasavica in the late 1990s was a Serbian ecologist named Slobodan Simić. His mandate was pure conservation, specifically the preservation of several endemic and critically endangered species that had been retreating from the Balkans for generations. Among those species was the Balkan donkey, a large and ancient breed that had once numbered in the tens of thousands across Serbia, Montenegro, and Bosnia, and had by the late 20th century been reduced to a few dozen surviving individuals scattered across the country. Simić began a breeding program, began documenting the biology of the animals, and in the course of that documentation, uncovered something in the nutritional profile of their milk that would force him to make a decision nobody in the conservation world had ever faced before. If you are finding this story worth following, a like tells the algorithm to show it to someone else who would. This channel runs one type of investigation, the origin that the mainstream food world decided was not worth telling. Subscribe if that is the kind of story you came here for, because we are about to get to the part that changes everything, the biology of the animal itself, and why a Serbian ecologist studying an endangered species accidentally created the most expensive dairy product on Earth. The Balkan donkey is not the compact, stubborn little creature that most people picture when they hear the word donkey. It is a larger and considerably more ancient breed, with a documented working history in the Balkans that stretches back over 2,000 years of agricultural records. At the peak of its population, roughly the early 20th century, tens of thousands of these animals worked the farms and mountain roads of southeastern Europe. By the time Simić began his conservation work, the total surviving population in Serbia had fallen to somewhere between 40 and 60 animals. They were not merely endangered, they were collapsing toward functional extinction, the state where a population is too small to sustain itself genetically, regardless of individual care. What makes the Balkan donkey biologically remarkable, and what changed the entire trajectory of Zasavica, is its milk. Donkey milk has appeared in the historical records since antiquity. The Roman encyclopedist Pliny the Elder wrote about its medicinal applications. Ancient Egyptian and Greek sources describe it as a healing substance. Cleopatra's famous milk baths, which appear in historical accounts from multiple cultures, are almost always identified as donkey milk in primary sources, not cow's milk, as later popular accounts frequently claim. But what modern analytical chemistry revealed about Balkan donkey milk specifically was something far more precise and far more extraordinary than anything the ancient world could have measured. The nutritional analysis of Balkan donkey milk produced results that the research team at Zasavica initially assumed were measurement errors. The milk contained a protein architecture dramatically unlike any bovine source, simultaneously rich in omega-3 fatty acids, casein, and vitamins A, B1, B2, B6, C, and E, in a combination essentially unknown in any other single animal food source. It also contained approximately 60 times the whey protein concentration of standard cow's milk, a finding so anomalous that independent laboratories in both Serbia and Italy were commissioned to verify it before anyone was willing to put the number in print. And then there was the hypoallergenic profile, the discovery that the fat globule structure and protein composition of Balkan donkey milk was closer, measurably and consistently, to human breast milk than to any other commercially available animal milk on the market. Here is the number that makes every other number in this story make sense. It takes approximately 6.6 gallons of Balkan donkey milk to produce a single pound of Pule cheese. A single healthy dairy cow, managed under standard commercial conditions, produces between 6 and 8 gallons of milk every single day. A Balkan donkey produces between 1 and 2 quarts per day on a good day, under optimal conditions, with a handler the animal knows and trusts. And unlike cows, donkeys cannot be machine-milked. Their anatomy does not accommodate standard commercial milking equipment, and attempts to introduce mechanical milking have been documented to increase the animal's stress levels to the point where milk production drops or stops entirely. Every quart of Balkan donkey milk at Zasavica is collected by hand, 3 times per day, by specific staff members who have established individual relationships with individual animals. When you factor in the milkable animals in the Zasavica herd at any given point in the production cycle, the daily yield, the 6.6-gallon conversion ratio, and the seasonal and biological variables that affect donkey lactation, the reserve's maximum annual output of Pule in an exceptional production year is somewhere in the range of 440 to 660 pounds. That is the total global supply. In a year when Pule makes the front page of the Financial Times or is included in a documentary about extreme luxury food, demand spikes dramatically, and the reserve is forced to maintain a waiting list. The reserve does not increase production in response to demand. It cannot. The herd is what it is, and the animals determine the output. The cheese-making process behind Pule is, in deliberate contrast to its price point, remarkably simple. There are no industrial additives, no synthetic rennet, no artificial preservatives or stabilizers of any kind. The milk collected each day is stored at a precisely controlled temperature and cultured using natural processes that Slobodan Simić and his team developed over years of careful experimentation, a method the reserve treats as proprietary and has not published in full detail anywhere in the academic or food science literature. The resulting cheese is white, slightly crumbly, and carries a flavor profile that professional food writers have consistently struggled to fit into any existing category. The most common description is a young manchego crossed with a fresh feta, with a subtle natural sweetness that is entirely absent from any cow or goat milk cheese. That sweetness, clean, soft, and faintly mineral, is the signature of the animal it comes from. Multiple independent scientific studies conducted across Serbia and Italy over the past 20 years have confirmed a finding that the Zasavica research team initially did not know how to use. Donkey milk and products derived from it produce the closest nutritional match to human breast milk of any food sourced from a non-human animal. The fat globule structure, the protein folding, and the enzyme activity patterns are all measurably and consistently similar in ways that bovine, ovine, and caprine milks simply are not. This is not a claim that appeared in a product marketing brochure. This is a finding published in peer-reviewed journals of pediatric nutrition and food science, examined independently by researchers who had no commercial interest in the outcome, and replicated across multiple populations and methodologies. We are at the halfway point of this investigation, and the second half is where the numbers become genuinely difficult to believe. If you are not subscribed, this is the moment to do it, because what comes next is the part of the Pule story that the luxury food press has a specific interest in not explaining too clearly, where every dollar of that price actually comes from, and who is quietly buying this cheese through channels that have nothing to do with fine dining. Subscribe and stay with this. The hypoallergenic properties of Pule have quietly created a secondary market that has almost nothing to do with luxury dining. There is a small but persistent community of families across Western Europe and Japan, parents of children with severe, life-threatening cow's milk protein allergies who have exhausted every conventional alternative, who source Pule as a dietary supplement. At over $450 per pound, this is an extraordinary financial burden to carry. But for a family that has been told by multiple specialists that their child cannot tolerate any standard formula or dairy product, and who then discovers through a Serbian research paper that donkey milk products have been tolerated without adverse reaction in clinical trials, the price very quickly becomes a secondary concern. This dimension of the Pule story, the medical one, is almost entirely absent from mainstream food reporting because it does not fit the luxury narrative that makes for easier editorial copy. Let us break the price down arithmetically, because $450 per pound sounds arbitrary until you trace exactly where every dollar comes from. Each pound requires approximately 6.6 gallons of milk, which requires the manual labor of 3 hand milking sessions per day across multiple animals, each session conducted by trained staff who have established individual trust relationships with specific donkeys, because a Balkan donkey handled by an unfamiliar person or stressed by environmental changes will reduce or cease milk production without warning. Add to this the daily veterinary oversight required for a herd of endangered animals under a conservation mandate, the specialized nutritional feed appropriate to the wetland environment, the cold chain logistics required to move fresh milk and finished cheese from a rural Serbian nature reserve to restaurants in Paris and Munich, and the administrative overhead of a conservation organization that must justify every operational cost to its government grant body. The price is not a decision. It is an equation. Compare this to how luxury food pricing is constructed almost everywhere else in the high-end food economy. A bottle of Dom Perignon sells for several $100s, partly because it is genuinely excellent, and partly because of decades of deliberate brand positioning, celebrity association, and what economists call prestige pricing, setting a price high specifically to create the perception of exceptional quality. White truffles from Alba command their premium partly due to seasonal scarcity and partly due to the carefully maintained mystique of the hunting tradition. Wagyu beef prices in export markets are significantly inflated by a complex certification and quota system managed by the Japanese beef industry for strategic commercial reasons. Pule has none of this infrastructure around it. There is no deliberate brand strategy operating at Zasavica. There is just the math of a rare animal producing a small amount of an extraordinary substance and the price that math produces. The buyers of Pule exist in a specific and unusual intersection of interests. The largest single market is European specialty food importers who supply Michelin-starred restaurants across France, Germany, Italy, and the United Kingdom, where Pule rarely appears as a centerpiece dish, but more commonly as a finishing element, a precise crumble of white cheese across a composed plate where its presence is felt more than seen. Serbian diplomatic channels have used Pule as a gift in high-level state meetings, and the cheese has been photographed in the context of the Serbian government on multiple occasions. There is also a growing collector market, buyers who acquire Pule not primarily to eat it, but to possess a certified example of the world's most exclusive food, to document the acquisition, and in some cases, to present it as a gift of extraordinary rarity. What the mainstream food press consistently underreports is the private secondary market for Pule. Transactions that occur between collectors, between specialist food brokers, and between buyers who learned about the cheese through medical rather than gastronomic channels. In documented private sales, a single pound of Pule, properly packaged, refrigerated, and accompanied by a Zasavica provenance certificate, has reportedly changed hands for over $900, double the standard retail price, without the reserve receiving any portion of that premium. This is the dynamic that appears in virtually every ultra-scarce luxury product category. Once the primary producer cannot meet demand, a secondary market forms, and that market operates entirely outside the original producer's pricing control. Slobodan Simić does not give many interviews, and the ones he has given to Serbian media are notable for what they consistently do not include: a narrative of deliberate commercial ambition. By his own account, the emergence of Pule as a global luxury food product was not planned. The cheese developed from the practical question of what to do with a growing surplus of donkey milk as the Zasavica herd expanded beyond the initial conservation targets. Simić is trained as an ecologist, not as a food scientist or a product developer, and the early experimentation with production was conducted by the reserve staff as a practical resource management exercise rather than a market entry strategy. He did not hire a consultancy to position the product. He did not approach food distributors. The first major wave of international press coverage came to him, not the other way around. Here is the version of the story that the available record does not contradict, but also cannot fully confirm. Slobodan Simić is a highly educated scientist who spent his career watching conservation projects across Eastern Europe fail, not because the science was wrong, but because the funding dried up. He understood, professionally and viscerally, that a reserve without a revenue model is a reserve that eventually closes. He also knew, from the nutritional research his team had produced, that he was sitting on something with extraordinary commercial potential in at least two distinct markets simultaneously, the luxury food market and the medical nutrition market, and that he had a product which could not, by its very nature, be replicated or competed with by any industrial food company in the world. Whether the development of Pule as a commercial product was a genuinely happy accident or a carefully managed strategic decision framed as an accident, that question has never been definitively answered. And it is exactly the kind of question that histories of extraordinary food products rarely think to ask. The broader question that the Pule story raises, and that the luxury food industry as a whole has a significant interest in not examining too carefully, is the difference between genuine scarcity and manufactured scarcity. In most categories of luxury food, the two are deeply intertwined, and almost impossible to fully separate. A wine from a single small vineyard in Burgundy is genuinely scarce in production, but exponentially scarcer in commercial terms because a complex network of negociants, auction houses, and collector communities have built a market structure around it that amplifies the scarcity and monetizes the mythology. The cost of the liquid in the bottle represents a fraction of what you pay. The rest is story, positioning, and perceived status, none of which is dishonest, exactly, but none of which is genuinely necessary either. What Zasavica has, accidentally or deliberately, achieved is something that most luxury product brands spend enormous budgets trying to manufacture. A scarcity story that is completely true, completely verifiable, and completely immune to industrial replication. No company with unlimited capital can produce Pule at scale. You cannot build a Balkan donkey farm that functions like a dairy cow operation. The biology does not allow it. The geography and conservation status of the breed do not allow it. The hand milking requirement does not allow it. And the 6.6 gallon conversion ratio means that even if every other constraint were removed, you would still need to milk more individual animals 3 times per day by hand than any rational food company would agree to manage. The scarcity of Pule is structural, baked into the product at the cellular level of the animal that produces it. The question of whether the price of Pule will ever decrease depends entirely on which of its structural constraints you are able to address first. An honest analysis suggests that none of them are addressable in the near term. If the Balkan donkey population at Zasavica grows significantly, which conservation efforts are working toward, the raw milk supply increases and the per-pound material cost of the cheese begins to decline. But the hand milking requirement does not change with herd size. You would need more trained staff, more operational infrastructure, more time, and more land, all of which introduce their own costs, and all of which are constrained by the conservation mandate that defines the reserve's legal and regulatory status. Increasing production also risks changing the global perception from ultra-scarce to merely expensive, and the reserve's management understands, at minimum intuitively, that this distinction is commercially critical. There is also a dynamic operating here that has no easy resolution. The people most likely to fund the expansion of the Zasavica herd are the same collectors and investors who are drawn precisely to Pule because of its extreme scarcity. They are not, as a category, motivated to invest in a project that will reduce the scarcity of the asset they have paid to possess. This creates a structural tension that is common to many ultra-rare natural products, from specific wine appellations to certain species of timber, where the conservation mission and the commercial mission are pulling in opposite directions and cannot both win simultaneously. Zasavica is managed for now as a conservation organization first and a food producer second. Whether the reserve's next generation of leadership will hold that hierarchy is a question worth watching closely. So where does the story of Pule ultimately leave us? We began with a question: how does a portion of plain white crumbly cheese end up worth more per pound than most people earn in a day? And the answer we have arrived at is not one cause, but a convergence of several extraordinary circumstances arriving at the same point simultaneously. An endangered animal whose biology had been invisible to commercial food science for thousands of years. A wetland reserve run by a single ecologist with a conservation mission and, possibly, a very clear-eyed understanding of what he had discovered. A nutritional profile so unusual that it opened 2 entirely different markets, luxury and medical, neither of which the other typically occupies. A production process that cannot be meaningfully accelerated, automated, or relocated. And a global food economy that turned out to be, against most predictions, willing to pay any price for something that was genuinely irreplaceable. The history of cheese, which is what this channel exists to tell, is ultimately the history of human beings finding ways to preserve something perishable, to transform something ordinary into something lasting, and to build entire cultures and economies around a process that began, in every single case, as a practical solution to a practical problem. Every cheese you have ever eaten began as an answer to a question that someone, somewhere, was desperate enough to ask. Too much milk. a long journey ahead, no other option. And from that accumulated necessity came 10,000 years of fermentation, culture, craft, and chemistry that gave the world everything from a $5 supermarket block to the white crumbly wheel sitting right now in a climate-controlled vault at Zasavica Special Nature Reserve, the world's most expensive cheese, made in a swamp, from the milk of an animal that nearly went extinct, by a man who may have understood exactly what he was doing from the very first day. If this story reached somewhere you were not expecting, subscribe to Origins of Cheese, because this is exactly the kind of investigation we run here. Every video on this channel begins with a question that the mainstream food world never thought to take seriously, and follows it until we find out what is actually at the other end. If you want to continue this journey, the video on the history of cheddar will take you somewhere equally surprising. A story involving industrial revolution, class warfare, and a British government program that almost destroyed an entire cheese tradition by accident. Leave your answer in the comments. If the money was not a concern, would you actually try Pule? I genuinely want to know.